Before I begin, welcome to this channel where I share long, first-person stories about family, betrayal, and the exact moment someone decides to stop being afraid. If you enjoy calm, detailed confessions that feel disturbingly real, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because what you're about to hear is how I discovered that the daughter I thought I had buried years ago was still alive, and how she had been draining my life from the shadows. My name is Martin Herrera. I'm 69 years old, and for the last 7 winters my only mission has been to keep together what was left of my family after it shipwrecked. Every January I would send my son-in-law a transfer of about 24,000 euros, a huge sum scraped together from the profits of my little neighborhood grocery store, money earned with my back bent over crates, with my fingers twisted by arthritis, and too many sleepless nights hunched over the account books. I did it for my granddaughter Sophia. I did it for my wife Elena, who faded away out of pure grief, convinced that our only daughter was gone forever. I did it for the woman I truly believed I had laid to rest under a cold stone. On paper, my daughter Laura had been dead for nearly 7 years. I was told her car left the road one dark night on the ring road just outside the city, that the impact had been brutal, and the vehicle had gone up in flames almost instantly. The forensic report was blunt. The body was too damaged for an open coffin. They handed us a plain metal urn with what they said were her remains after the fire. We agreed to cremation on my son-in-law's recommendation, too stunned to question anything. A few months later, Elena followed her. Doctors wrote down heart failure in complicated terms on the report, but everyone around us knew the truth. She died of sadness. Losing Laura ripped her soul out, and her heart decided there was no point in going on in such an empty world. So in the end, only 3 of us were left: my granddaughter Sophia, my son-in-law Diego, and me. Diego was supposed to be raising the girl alone, and I was financing that solitude. Those January transfers were the price I paid for a promise I once made to Laura, that her little girl would never go without, no matter what. That's what family does, I kept telling myself, so I wouldn't feel like a walking cash machine. Part of that mission was our ritual every second Saturday. I would pick up Sophia and take her to the big park by the lake, what we called Riverside Gardens. We always sat near the water or under the wide, protective crown of a horse chestnut tree and repeated the same ritual. A vanilla ice cream for me, a strawberry one for her. That was our tiny bubble of peace since Laura had gone. Laura was my whole life. On that September afternoon, when the heat in the city had finally started to ease a little, Sophia sat beside me on our usual bench, swinging her light-up sneakers and telling me excitedly that she had gotten top marks on her last language test. "You're a little genius," I told her, squeezing her shoulder with pride. She smiled at me with the same shy, crooked smile Laura used to give me, and for a fleeting second the pain in my chest felt like a distant shadow. Then her face changed. It was as if someone had turned down the brightness in her eyes. "Grandpa," she whispered, lowering her voice so much I could barely hear her over the rustling leaves. She glanced nervously towards the playground, making sure nobody was listening, then pressed herself tighter against my side. "Please stop sending money to Dad." I froze. The air around us turned heavy. "What are you saying, sweetheart? Why would you say that? The money you send in January. Don't give it to him anymore." Her small hand pinned the sleeve of my cardigan as she looked up at me with an expression that twisted my stomach. It was fear, a deep, liquid fear that didn't belong in the eyes of a child her age. "Please stop. You have to watch him, Grandpa. There's something you need to see." My chest hurt, as if someone had driven a red-hot nail through it. "Sophia, look at me. What's going on at home? Does Diego treat you well? Just watch him," she repeated, suddenly jumping down from the bench like she had said something forbidden. "We have to go. If we get home late, he'll be in a bad mood, and I don't want him angry." The drive to the townhouse on the outskirts of the city was buried in a silence so thick that even the clicking of the turn's signal sounded too loud. Sophia hugged her school backpack, eyes fixed on the window and the passing apartment blocks. Diego lived in a terraced house we had helped to buy a few years earlier, thanks to a bank check I had signed without blinking. White facade, dark shutters, always a little too close, a little too dark. He was waiting on the porch, checking his watch impatiently. "You're late," he snapped, without even saying hello. There was a traffic jam on the main avenue. I lied, trying to keep my voice steady. Sophia climbed out of the car with her head down and slipped past her father like a ghost, heading straight for the refuge of the interior. He didn't touch her, didn't ask how her day went. "Get inside and work on your math homework," he barked. I stood there on the sidewalk, watching through the big window as my granddaughter sat at the dining table with the rigid posture of a little soldier. Diego walked behind her while talking on his phone, acting as if she didn't exist at all. A shiver ran down my back that had nothing to do with the mild autumn breeze. "Diego," I called out before he could close the door. "Is everything okay? I've noticed Sophia seems a little different today." He shrugged with that indifference that had always bothered me, which I used to excuse as his way of coping with grief. "Kids go through phases, Martine. Mood swings, little dramas. It's normal." He paused, leaned against the doorframe, and looked at me with a new intensity. "By the way, do you think there's any chance you could advance this year's payment? I've had some surprise expenses with the roof repairs and a couple of pending bills." "Advance it? We're in September, Diego. There are still months until January. What kind of expenses are that urgent? You know what it takes to keep a place like this going on my own," he said, avoiding my eyes. "Forget it if it's a problem. We'll manage. See you next Saturday." He slammed the door. I went back to my car and sat there with the engine running, squeezing the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. My thoughts were boiling. Watch him. 24,000 euros a year. And he still wanted more whenever he could. Over 7 years, I had handed him a small fortune. It was a lot of money for a man who apparently couldn't spare a single kind look for his own daughter. I drove back to my small apartment in the center of the city as the sky turned a violent purple in the distance. The place greeted me with the same heavy silence that had moved in the day Elena left. Some nights I still reach out to her side of the bed in the dark, forgetting for a second that all I'll find there are cold sheets. That night, there was no chance of sleep. I replayed every awkward dinner with Diego, every time he had asked for more money, but never invited me past the hallway, every moment that had felt off, but I had brushed aside because grief was a thick fog. Then my mind dragged me back to the night everything supposedly changed. I will never forget the knock on the door in the dead of night. 2 officers in uniform, standing rigid, faces carefully neutral in that practiced way people adopt when they are about to collapse someone else's world. They told me there had been a crash on the ring road, that my daughter's car had left the lane near an overpass, hit a concrete pillar, and gone up in flames. While they spoke, I remember thinking that the street outside my window was too quiet, too indifferent to the catastrophe that had just stepped into my living room. I asked which hospital she was in, ready to grab my jacket. One of them shook his head with a slowness that still makes my skin crawl. There had been a structural fire after the impact. There was nothing to be done. According to the report, any identification had to be done by dental records, and my son-in-law had already been there to provide them. It was in that exact moment that Elena's knees gave out and the air seemed to leave our house for good. Details came later, drop by drop, like acid on an open wound. Laura had been driving home late after dinner with her best friend from university. They said the car lost control for no obvious reason, crashed into a pillar, and became a funeral pyre in seconds. By the time firefighters arrived, the metal was a black, twisted mass, and the interior held nothing recognizable. The funeral was held with a sealed coffin because, they told us, it had to be that way. Diego stood beside me for the whole service at the basilica, holding baby Sophia in his arms. The little one was only a few months old, a bundle of white blankets that didn't understand why her grandfather was sobbing with that ugly, muffled sound. I remember thinking how cruel it was that she would never have a single clear memory of her mother's face, her laugh, or the smell of her perfume. A few days later they gave us a simple metal urn, cold and heavy. It sat on our mantelpiece for a week before Elena could even bring herself to stand near it. "We should take her to Lake Escondido," she said one morning, her voice hollow, as if coming from another room. "Do you remember how happy she was there?" Of course I remembered. We had spent all her childhood summers at that reservoir. That's where Laura learned to swim without floats, where she caught her first fish with a clumsy bamboo rod I made, where she stole her first teenage kiss under an old wooden pier. That lake was her place in the world. But then Elena simply broke. 6 months after the funeral, her heart surrendered. Doctors wrote down terms like cardiomyopathy and sudden cardiac arrest. I wrote down only one sentence in my head. She died of heartbreak. I watched her fade away a little more every day, get thinner, quieter, more transparent, until one autumn morning I woke up and her side of the bed was still as a photograph. I found her on the kitchen floor, collapsed beside the old Italian coffee pot Laura had once given us for Christmas. After that, I lost the will to do anything that hurt more than breathing. I couldn't force myself to drive to Lake Escondido. I couldn't imagine scattering those ashes. That urn felt like the last grain of matter connecting me to my daughter. I had already lost too much, so the urn stayed there, presiding over my solitude for 7 long years. The only thing that kept my head above water was the store. Herrera Groceries had been in my family since the late 80s. My father opened it, and I took over when he decided he had carried enough sacks of beans and cut enough salt cod for one lifetime. It isn't a fancy place, just a corner shop in a strategic spot off the main street. The kind of place where the floor creaks, the air smells of cured meats, aged cheese, and freshly ground coffee, and people still call you by your name. Some of the older customers still pay with neatly folded bills and counted coins. Everyone in the neighborhood knew Laura, and everyone came to the funeral. After Elena died, the shop became my bunker. I opened at 6 in the morning, filled the shelves with obsessive precision, served regulars, and didn't close until 8 at night. Routine became my anesthetic. It stopped my mind from wandering through the empty apartment or staring at the framed photos on the wall, those frozen faces that would never move again. Above all, I fulfilled my promise. Shortly before the accident, at one of our last dinners together, Laura had made me promise, half joking, that if anything ever happened to her, I would make sure her daughter never lacked anything. And I did. Every January, I sent Diego a transfer for those 24,000 euros, and he always tried to stretch it to more, up to 36,000, with excuses about private schools and fancy doctors. The money flew from my account to his, year after year. It wasn't just about the euros. It was about keeping my daughter's memory alive and guaranteeing that her little girl had the future that had been snatched from her mother. But Sophia's words in the park had opened a crack in my armor. "Grandpa, stop sending him money. There's something you have to see." That night, I stood in the living room, staring at Laura's urn in the half-light. For 7 years I had treated it like something sacred, and suddenly, for the first time, I dared to think that something might be horribly wrong. What if my 7-year-old granddaughter had seen a truth my tired eyes had refused to face? I started to reconstruct the accident detail by detail. Laura had been driving a route she knew by heart, on a dry night with no traffic. How could she have lost control that completely? How could the fire have been so thorough that it erased her entirely, yet left intact the dental records that Diego so conveniently supplied? I had never questioned him. He was her husband, the father of my granddaughter. He was supposed to have loved her, and I had been too busy drowning in my own grief to suspect anything. But now, with Sophia's frightened whisper echoing in my ears, a question began to burn in my chest. What on earth had I really been paying for all those years? The woman who changed everything walked into my life on a Tuesday morning, right when the first sun hit the asphalt on Market Street. The days after Sophia's warning at the park had been a blur of frayed nerves and broken sleep. I did my usual tasks, but my thoughts kept circling back to her small voice, "Watch him." And I tried. Twice, after closing the shop, I drove past Diego's townhouse. Both times I parked down the street like a crazy old man who had lost his mind and just sat there staring at the lowered shutters. Nothing seemed out of place. A man leaving for work, a man coming home, living his life as the exemplary widower everyone thought he was. I started to tell myself I was being paranoid or that this was just a child's imagination. Tuesdays at Herrera Groceries were normally predictable, and there was comfort in that routine. Mrs. Rivera came around 7 in the morning for her tea and biscuits. Old Tomas showed up at 8, punctual as a clock, for his lottery tickets and to complain about his pension. At 9, there was a small rush of office workers grabbing coffee and cold cuts before their shifts. I knew their steps, their habits, their favorite brands. It was a human map I could read with my eyes closed. But at 9:15, a woman came in and tore that map in two. I noticed her instantly because she wasn't from the neighborhood, and in a shop like mine, a new face stands out like a stain on a white tablecloth. She was 30-ish, with dark hair pulled back into a tight ponytail, jeans, and a fitted leather jacket that screamed expensive from a mile away. She moved with a feline kind of confidence, no hesitation, straight to the coffee aisle. I was behind the worn wooden counter, fighting with electricity bills, my fingers stiff and clumsy arthritis groaning in every joint. Age has a cruel way of slowing your hands while the world speeds up around you. She laid a bag of ground coffee and a small jar of cinnamon sticks on the counter. "Just this," she said. "Is that all for you?" I asked, forcing a polite tone I didn't feel. "Yes." Her voice was short and dry, not rude but distant, like someone who wants to finish a transaction as fast as possible. She handed me a 20-euro note without lifting her eyes, avoiding any eye contact. "Your change is 15.80, I said, counting the coins. She took them in a quick motion and turned to leave. I should have gone back to my bills. But as she walked past me and pushed the door open, something tugged at an invisible thread in my memory. The angle of her jaw, the way she carried herself, her profile from the side. There was something familiar there, like a name stuck on the tip of your tongue that you just can't say out loud. "Excuse me," I called before she crossed the threshold. She stopped and glanced back at me over her shoulder. Her eyes were dark and hard to read. "Have we met before? Are you from around here?" Her expression didn't change. It was like talking to a mask. "I don't think so, sir. I'm not from this part of town. It's just that you remind me so much of someone I once knew," I insisted. She gave me a thin, chilly half-smile. "People tell me I have a very common face." She pushed the door open, and the bell above it chimed as she left. I stood there with a dust cloth in my hand, trying to place that face in some old photograph or half-forgotten neighborhood memory. 20 minutes later, I stepped outside to set up the signboard with the day's specials. When I looked up, my heart almost stopped. Across the street, next to a silver car that was badly parked, I saw her again. And she wasn't alone. Diego was there, leaning against the car, relaxed, one hand in his pocket, a satisfied smile on his face I hadn't seen since before Laura's death. She said something that made him laugh openly. Then, with a familiarity that made my stomach clench, she touched his arm in a light, almost caressing gesture and slid into the driver's seat. Diego walked around the vehicle and got in on the passenger side. I froze on the sidewalk with the signboard in my hands, watching as the car turned onto the main street and disappeared. Questions started hammering inside my skull. Who was this woman? Why was Diego meeting her right in front of my store if he was supposed to be at the office? Why had he never mentioned having such a close relationship with anyone? I went back inside and locked the door, something I had never done at that hour. I sat on a stool, surrounded by the smell of cheese and sawdust, and suddenly the aroma of coffee and cinnamon hit me like a slap. It was an odd combination, one that meant something. Laura used to say coffee without cinnamon wasn't real coffee. It was her little signature. A shiver ran up my spine. Sophia's voice echoed again in the empty shop. "Watch him." I had watched, and what I had seen made no sense. Diego had never mentioned any woman, not even as a friend. So who was she, and why were they hiding in plain sight? My hands shaking, I pulled out my old phone. Javier Molina had been my best friend for 40 years. We met standing outside the school gate when our daughters were little. Javier had spent 3 decades as a detective before he retired. He knew how to read between lines and sniff out rot where everyone else saw normal life. I hadn't wanted to bother him before. I didn't want to sound like a paranoid old man chasing ghosts because of something a child had whispered. But now there was this woman, the woman buying coffee and cinnamon like some ghost from my past. I found his contact and typed with difficulty. "I need your help, Javi. Can you come to the shop as soon as you can? It's urgent." His reply came 2 minutes later. "On my way." "Put the coffee on." I set the phone on the counter and looked around. The shelves full of canned goods, the old scale, the sacks of flour, everything looked the same. Same stage, same props. But deep down, in that part of me that still carried my parents' war scars and the instinct to survive 3 economic crises, I knew something was rotten, and I feared the smell was coming from Diego's house. Javier walked into Herrera Groceries exactly 23 minutes after my message. Despite being almost my age, he still had that old-school detective presence. Short gray hair, straight jeans, a checkered shirt ironed with military precision. He moved with a lean economy of motion, the way only someone who spent decades walking city streets and dealing with the worst of people can move. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said instead of hello. "Thanks for your sensitivity, as always," I muttered with a bitter smile. He glanced around the empty shop. "You closed early?" I flipped the sign. "I don't want Mrs. Rivera interrupting us asking about saffron prices." Javier sat on one of the high stools by the counter where I usually drank my mid-morning coffee. Tell me what's going on. I didn't quite know how to start, so I started at the beginning, with Sophia. I told him every detail about that afternoon at the park, the whisper under the chestnut tree, the shaking in her hands, that liquid fear in her eyes when she asked me to stop feeding her father's bank account. Watch him. Javier didn't interrupt once. He just took out his small notebook, the same kind he'd always used, and began to scribble with a worn pen. He had that work mode look I remembered from the days when he ran investigations at the Central Precinct. Then I moved on to what had happened that morning. The woman in the leather jacket, the smell of coffee and cinnamon that felt like a fist from the past, the secretive meeting with Diego around the corner. Did you catch the license plate? Javier asked, eyes still on his notes. No, I was in shock. I wasn't expecting any of it. It was a silver sedan, one of those modern ones with tinted rear windows. I'm not even sure of the brand. My legs simply failed me. He jotted something down. Let's talk about the woman then. Height, build, anything that stands out. Scars, tattoos, walk. Maybe about 170, very slim but strong. Dark hair pulled into a tight ponytail. Early 30s, I'd say. That leather jacket with gold zippers looked expensive. Not the kind of thing you pick up at a flea market. And I hesitated. And she reminded you of someone. Javier tapped his pen rhythmically on the counter. Think, Martine. Memories aren't random. They're badly filed documents. It's just a feeling, a shadow in my head. I can't put a name to it. So Diego never mentioned any friend, let alone a woman who dresses like that. Javier said slowly. But he's been asking you for 24,000 euros a year, and sometimes more for 7 years. It's for Sophia. I snap on reflex, as if I had to defend Diego. The money is so she never lacks anything. For school, her future. Sure, Javier replied, voice neutral, eyes saying something else. For the girl. Tell me, when was the last time Diego showed you a detailed expense breakdown? A tuition invoice from that private school? A receipt for all those extra activities? I opened my mouth and nothing came out. Reality hit me like a slow, heavy train. I had no answer. Diego had never given me proof of anything. He accepted the transfers each January with a, thank you, Dad. Laura would be proud. And that was that. I, blinded by grief and guilt of being the one still alive, had never dared to ask. He's raising a daughter alone. I mumbled, though my own voice sounded weak and pathetic to my ears. I wanted to trust him, for the family's sake. Javier snapped his notebook closed with a sharp motion. When a 7-year-old girl tells her grandfather to stop giving money to her father and to spy on him, that is not a tantrum. That's a distress signal. Something stinks in that house, and it isn't the plumbing. I leaned on the counter and covered my face with my hands. I know what you're thinking, he went on, his tone softening. You're wondering if you really want me to dust off my old toys. If you're ready for what that means. Because if we get caught, there's no walking this back. I need to know if Sophia is in danger, I said quietly. If Diego is in trouble, or if he's burning through my life savings on God knows what. Javier leaned back and sighed. We'll start with the basics. I still have some surveillance gear stashed away. Long-range thermal cameras, directional microphones. Tomorrow morning we'll set up nearby and watch his place. We'll see who goes in, who goes out, and, most importantly, whether your cinnamon woman shows up again. We'll map his routine until we know how many times he breathes per minute. And if we don't find anything, he let the sentence hang. If we don't find anything, he finished. It'll mean Sophia is just going through a rough patch and you'll be able to sleep again. But he looked at me over his glasses, and something in his expression chilled my blood. I've been sniffing out lies for a long time, Martine, and my gut says tomorrow is not going to be boring. What time? I asked. I'll pick you up at 6. Wear dark clothes and bring real coffee in a thermos. None of that instant stuff. Javier headed for the door, then stopped with his hand on the knob. And Martine, don't feel guilty about this. Protecting a child is the only law that matters. Even if you have to step over politeness with your son-in-law. Especially if it's with him. He left, and the bell over the door chimed in the stale shop air. I was alone again, surrounded by sacks of chickpeas and stacked cans, feeling like I had just crossed a point of no return. The next day we would hunt for the truth, and something told me I wouldn't like what I found through that lens. That same night, Before trying to sleep, which I knew was pointless, I spread 7 years of bank statements across my kitchen table. Under the yellow light of the ceiling lamp, one number kept punching me in the temples like a hammer. 260,000 euros. It wasn't just the money. The shop had always allowed us to live decently, and Elena and I, children of lean post-war years, had learned to save like ants. What made me sick was the size of the betrayal. That sum represented 7 years of sacred promises, 7 years of sweat, and early mornings to honor my daughter's memory by taking care of her family. What if her family didn't actually need taking care of? What if they had been feeding off my pain like parasites? I stared into the living room, eyes fixed on the metal urn above the fireplace. Coffee and cinnamon. 2 everyday items that had lit a suspicious spark in my chest. I spent the whole evening trying to figure out why that particular combination twisted my stomach. And there, in the dim light, while the wall clock ticked with cruel indifference, I finally understood. My eyes jumped from the urn to a framed photo next to it. There we were, Laura, Elena, and I at Lake Escondido, soaked, laughing in front of a giant pan of rice, the August sun burning our faces. "I'm sorry, Elena," I whispered to my wife's smiling image. I should have had the courage to look closer, much earlier. I had avoided touching that urn for 7 years. I told myself it was out of respect, because I couldn't let her go. But maybe the truth was more bitter. Maybe some corner of my mind had always known that the story of the accident was a little too perfect, a little too clean. I reached out and picked it up. It was heavier than I remembered. The lid was just a simple screw top. No wax seals, nothing official. For a long minute, I held it against my chest, feeling the cold metal, remembering Elena sobbing in that same corner, remembering the sealed coffin we were never allowed to open, remembering Diego's face at the funeral, so neutral it often seemed rehearsed. I carried the urn to the kitchen table and set it under the fluorescent light. My hands trembled so much that the shop keys jingled in my pocket. "Forgive me if I'm wrong, Laura," I whispered. I began to twist the lid. The thread gave with a small metallic squeak that echoed like a scream in the silent apartment. I braced myself for gray ash, for fragments of bone, for the final remains of a young life cut short. Instead, I saw something dark and granular. I dipped my fingers inside, heart pounding, and pulled out a handful. It wasn't ash. It was ground coffee mixed with powdered cinnamon. I stared at my brown-stained palms, that sweet bitter smell filling my kitchen in an almost obscene way. There was no trace of death, no human remains, just the contents of a grocery shelf. The emptiness I felt in that second was worse than the day of the reported accident. It was the emptiness of having been tricked in the most sacred place. At that exact moment, my phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a message from Javier. "I've been reviewing the footage from the cameras we set up this afternoon. You need to see this. Now, come over." I drove through the nearly empty streets like a man possessed, rolling through yellow lights with my hands still stained with that cursed coffee. Javier was waiting in his little office, a cramped room packed with monitors and old case files. "Look," he said, without any preamble, pointing to a screen. It showed the entrance to Diego's townhouse. The timestamp read 8 in the evening. The silver sedan pulled up in front of the house. The woman in the leather jacket got out, but this time she didn't head for the front door. Diego stepped out onto the porch, glanced up and down the street, then quickly ushered her toward the garage. Javier pressed a key and the image changed. Now, the camera angle was from behind the house. "I managed to piggyback onto a neighbor's security system," Javier explained, his voice professional, but his eyes burning with anger. "Watch the window on the top floor. The master bedroom." The image zoomed in digitally. The woman stood there under the warm light of bedside lamps, taking off her jacket in slow motions. Diego entered the frame and wrapped his arms around her from behind, burying his face in her neck. They were both laughing. Then she turned and kissed him, a long, deep kiss with a passion that left no room for doubt. The lighting was clear. "Nos a dos, no excuses." She pulled her hair tie out, and her dark hair fell over her shoulders. The air left my lungs as if someone had punched me. I had to grab the edge of Javier's desk to keep from collapsing. "No," I whispered, with tears blurring my vision. "No, it can't be. I'm truly sorry," Javier said, placing a hand on my shoulder. "But you see it too. That is not just some woman, Javi. Look at her. Look properly. He leaned closer to the screen, adjusting his glasses. I didn't need to. My whole body already knew. It's Laura, I said, and my voice broke into a sob that had been locked up for 7 years. My daughter isn't dead. She's alive. And all this time, she's been stealing my life. The world seemed to tilt, leaving me hanging over a bottomless hole. My girl, the one I had mourned every night through 7 winters, the one I believed reduced to coffee-scented dust in a fake urn, was there on that grainy screen, laughing, kissing the man who had been milking me for money, 24,000 euros a year, plus every extra cent he could squeeze out of me with emotional blackmail, all based on an absence he had carefully manufactured. We have to go there now, I said, standing with a strength I didn't know I had. Call your old station. Get patrol cars. That bastard has my daughter. Sit down, Martine, Javier ordered, firm but calm, using that commanding tone that cuts through panic. If we storm in now, we might scare them into running. Or worse, Diego might do something desperate. We need to understand the how and the why. Why would Laura hide? How is it possible no one realized? We spent the rest of the night dissecting the web of lies. Javier started pulling strings, waking up old contacts in registry offices and the medical examiner's department. Piece by piece, the ugly truth emerged. The crash on the ring road had happened exactly when they said. But the victim wasn't my daughter. It was Carla, her best friend from university. The fire had been so intense that nobody could identify the body visually. As Laura's husband and closest relative on paper, Diego had been the one to confirm the identity. To make sure the lie held, he used falsified dental records that someone, probably a corrupt doctor or clerk, had provided for a price. But why Carla? I asked, feeling bile rise in my throat. She was an orphan, Javier explained flatly. No parents, no siblings. It took a long time before a distant cousin even started asking questions. By then, Diego had already collected the life insurance, sold the car, and you had started sending your annual transfers. He created the perfect ghost. What we found out the next day, thanks to a directional microphone Javier hid in a hedge by Diego's yard, was even more sinister. Laura was not some happy accomplice enjoying the spoils. On the recording, we heard an argument that froze my blood. Diego had her under total psychological control. He had convinced her that the crash was her fault, that she had killed Carla because of some supposed distraction at the wheel. According to his twisted narrative, if the truth ever came out, Laura would spend the rest of her life in prison for her friend's death. He kept her captive in her own home, letting her leave only on rare occasions, always under his watch or following strict rules. Sophia, my brave little Sophia, had seen everything. She had watched her father control, humiliate, and terrify her mother day after day behind those lowered shutters. That's why she had that horror in her eyes. That's why she begged me to close the tap of money. She knew the cash was feeding the bars of her mother's invisible cell. The following Friday, at dawn, the silence on that quiet street broke forever. With Javier's help and a small team of his former colleagues, we prepared the raid. We didn't just want to rescue. We wanted Diego to pay for every stolen euro, every tear Sophia had shed, and every false year of mourning that had aged my soul. The sound of the battering ram shattering the front door was the sweetest, most liberating noise I have ever heard. Diego tried to escape through the kitchen, but Javier intercepted him in the hallway, slammed him against the wall, and cuffed him with a professional efficiency sharpened by decades, and, this time, by personal rage. I climbed the stairs 2 at a time, ignoring the stabbing pain in my knees. In the master bedroom, I found Laura huddled in a corner, hands over her ears, shaking like a leaf. When she saw me, her eyes opened wide and the cold, distant mask I'd seen in the shop vanished. She no longer looked like the mysterious woman in the leather jacket. She looked like my lost girl, pulled from a shipwreck after 7 long years underwater. "Dad," she whispered, her voice rough from disuse. I wrapped my arms around her, afraid I might break her, and I cried. I cried for Elena, who never got to see this moment. I cried for the stolen years and the freedom regained. "You're safe now," I told her. "The nightmare is over. We're going home." Outside, I saw Sophia in the garden, watched over by an officer. She looked at me, and for the first time her smile wasn't just a pale echo of Laura's. It was its own, bright and brave. Diego was loaded into the police van to a chorus of angry whispers and jeers from neighbors who had come out in their pajamas. As the sun finally cleared the rooftops, I knew Herrera Groceries would soon have new hands behind the counter. I was going to spend whatever time I had left reclaiming, minute by minute, the 7 years that had been stolen from us. That is my story, and if you stayed with me until the end, thank you. If it resonated with you, tap the like button, write in the comments what part hit you the hardest, and tell me where you're listening from. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because there are many more stories like this one on the way.